They didn't just convict the wrong man, they built him. Piece by piece, a confession he never gave, a witness who was never there, evidence buried in a file room for 30 years, the Waukegan Police Department constructed a guilty man out of thin air and put him on death row. His name was Robert Malak. He was 22 years old, and the person they told the jury he murdered was his own grandmother. He spent 34 years in an Illinois prison for it. Not because the evidence pointed to him. There was no evidence. Not a single piece of physical or forensic proof ever connected Robert Malak to that crime. He was there because they needed someone to be guilty, and they chose him. The question this story asks is not whether Robert Malak was innocent. That answer came 34 years too late. The question is how many people inside that police department looked at what they were doing and kept going anyway. In January 1989, Robert Malak was 22 years old and living with his maternal grandmother in Waukegan, Illinois, a small industrial city on Lake Michigan, about an hour north of Chicago. He was not a perfect young man. He had a prior theft conviction and was on parole, which meant he was living carefully, reporting regularly, staying close to family. His paternal grandmother, Augustine Malak, lived just a few blocks away. He knew her. He visited. She was 72 years old and had lived in that same Waukegan neighborhood for decades. On the night of January 14, 1989, Robert was with his girlfriend Cynthia. They bought a case of beer, drove around town, stopped at a bowling alley twice, ended up at a house party. It was an ordinary night, the kind that leaves no particular mark on your memory because nothing happened. Cynthia had to be home by midnight. Robert told her if she couldn't come back for him by 1:30 in the morning, he'd walk. That detail, the time, the plan, the ordinary logistics of a 22-year-old's Friday night would become the small thread the prosecution tried to pull everything from. He walked home. He went to sleep. The next morning, the police came looking for him. On January 15, 1989, Augustine Malak was found dead inside her home. She had been strangled, stabbed, and sexually assaulted. A chair had been placed over her body. The side door had been forced open, glass shattered. It was, by any measure, a brutal and disturbing scene. Lake County had rarely seen anything like it. Police moved fast. Within hours, they were focused on one person, her grandson Robert. He was nearby. He was on parole. He had lied to officers when they first came asking questions, telling them he had been home earlier than he actually was. He explained this later. He was on parole and didn't want police knowing he had been out drinking. A panicked lie, a stupid one, but the lie of a 22-year-old afraid of his parole officer, not the lie of a murderer. He gave a blood sample. He identified the clothes he had been wearing. He cooperated. Days later, police learned he had borrowed a throwing knife from his brother-in-law months earlier. A parole violation. They had what they needed to bring him in. On the morning of January 19th, detectives woke Robert Malak and brought him to the station. What happened over the next 17 hours is the center of everything. Detectives Tessman and Meady interrogated Robert without pause. They used a technique specifically designed to produce confessions through psychological pressure, isolation, and the slow dismantling of a suspect's resistance. A technique that has broken innocent people into signing false confessions all over this country, over and over again. By 1:45 in the morning on January 20th, Robert Malak had signed a confession. He would spend the next 3 decades saying he never meant a word of it. The prosecution presented the confession at trial. They also presented Susan Holloway, a woman who testified that while locked up in the county jail, she had heard Robert Malak spontaneously confess to killing his grandmother. A jury convicted him. They sentenced him to death. Prosecutors told the court Robert Malak did not deserve hope, did not deserve light at the end of the tunnel. He was 22 years old when those words were said about him in open court. He sat there and took them. The first conviction was eventually reversed on appeal, not because of innocence, but because of legal errors at trial. In 1993, Robert faced a second trial. No death sentence this time. Instead, the judge handed down nearly 100 years in prison, a different number, the same life. Robert Malak kept filing appeals. Year after year, every request for post-conviction relief was denied. But there was something sitting in a file that no one had properly examined. In 2023, the Lake County State's Attorney's Conviction Integrity Unit reviewed the case. For the first time, Robert's attorneys were given access to the full prosecution file. What they found inside it changed everything. Start with Susan Holloway, the jailhouse informant. The woman who sat in a courtroom and testified under oath that she heard Robert Malak confess to murdering his grandmother. The prison logs showed she was never there. Susan Holloway was not incarcerated at the same time as Robert Malak. The records were clear. Another woman had been present during the relevant time, and that woman had already told investigators she heard nothing. She refused to implicate him. So police found someone else willing to say what they needed. Susan Holloway had never met Robert Malak. She had never been in that jail at the same time as him, and she testified anyway. Now go back to Detective Lucian Tessman, the lead interrogator, the man who sat across from a 22-year-old for 17 hours and produced that confession. Tessman had done this before. Juan Rivera, convicted in 1992 of the rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl in Waukegan, exonerated in 2011. Tessman was involved. Herman Williams, convicted in 1993 of murdering his ex-wife, exonerated in 2022. Tessman was involved again. The same detective, the same city, the same method, 3 innocent people. When Robert's attorneys presented this pattern to the court, the prosecution and defense filed a joint statement, together, acknowledging that Tessman's history constituted substantial, newly discovered evidence that changed the picture entirely. There had never been any physical evidence, not one forensic trace, no blood, no DNA, no fingerprints, nothing that placed Robert Malak inside that house on that night. He had been convicted on a coerced signature and the testimony of a woman who was never in the room. That is the entirety of what put him on death row. On December 12, 2023, Robert Malak walked out of an Illinois prison. His conviction was vacated, all charges dismissed. He was 57 years old. He had gone in at 22. His public defender from 1989, a young attorney named David Brodsky, who had fought so hard at the original trial that a judge held him in contempt for pushing back on the interrogation tactics, had never let the case go. Brodsky became chief public defender, then a judge. Then he retired. And when he retired, he picked Robert's case back up and helped carry it to the finish line. 34 years later. In April 2025, a court issued Robert Malak a certificate of innocence. His record was expunged. He became the 201st person added to the Death Penalty Information Center's innocence database, the 23rd person exonerated in Illinois alone. Illinois abolished the death penalty in 2011. One of the reasons cited was the state's long and documented history of sending innocent people to death row. Robert Malak was almost one of them. He has said that receiving the certificate felt like a weight leaving his body, that he can finally hold his head up. He is 57 years old. He has never been compensated. The lawsuit is still pending. 34 years. For a confession he was broken into signing. For a witness who was never in the building. Here is the truth this case puts in front of you. When a police department decides who is guilty before the investigation begins, the investigation stops being a search for truth and becomes a construction project. Waukegan built Robert Malloch's guilt out of pressure, fabrication, and silence, and the system let it stand for 34 years. If the jailhouse informant had never been exposed as a lie, if those prison logs had never surfaced, where would Robert Malloch be today? Leave your answer below. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told with the weight they actually carry, not as content, but as a record. If that matters to you, subscribe.